There Will Be Wolves by Karleen Bradford, Chapter 10. It was not so much a march as a headlong flight. They didn't even dare stop to make camp that night, but forged on until they reached the Save River or across the Danube, and put it between them and the Hungarians. Only then did they feel safe. When they reached Belgrade, they found the town deserted. The people of the city had heard of the massacre in Semlin and had fled to the mountains. Peter's army took advantage of this to pillage the city. When the townsfolk come back, they will find nothing, Bruno reported bitterly to Ursula. The city has been sacked completely. Bringing more ill will upon us, Ursula answered. Our crimes are mounting, Bruno. When will we have to pay for them? Soon, most likely, he answered. The successful eluding of the Hungarians and the sack of the Belgrade combined to raise the spirits of the soldiers of the crusade enormously. Confident now that the Hungarians would not be able to catch up with them, and assured that the Bulgarians were too fearful to deny them anything, they set out along the road to the Nish triumphantly. They had to leave the Dunby here, however, as it turned sharply eastward, and the road to Constantinople lay more to the south. For the first time since leaving Cologne, they no longer had a river to carve a path for them. The way now lay through heavy forests, with only the occasional clearing and village. At night, wolves howled again, and the underbush was alive with the sounds of animals hunting. Bears roamed these forests, and wild boar. One night, as they huddled around their fire, Ursula heard the scream of an animal somewhere in the blackness beyond their small circle of light. She shuddered and drew Verity close to her. Only that day they had found a woman in hysterics in one of the tiny villages they had passed through. Wolves had taken her child, they said. They reached Nish in 7 days. By that time everyone was exhausted. The food they had stolen from Belgrade was gone, and hunger once again became a daily way of life. It was a vast relief then to hear that in spite of what they had done, the Crusaders were allowed to camp outside the city for a few days, and the governor, Nish, would provide food for them. As security that there would be no repetition of the sacking and pillaging, however, he'd taken 2 hostages, Geoffrey Burrell and the Frankish Walter of Brito. To Ursula's surprise, no sooner had they made camp than the townspeople began to swarm in, bringing food and even alms to many of the poorer pilgrims. For the space of this short time, it seemed that sanity had returned to the world. With the food and rest, even Master William's health began to rally. Ursula's hopes rose as she saw him doing more and more of the daily tasks and becoming more cheerful. He even began to talk confidently again about their mission. "We're over halfway to Constantinople, daughter," he said. "Soon we will be there, and I will see it, the most wondrous city in the world, it is said. And then on to Jerusalem." "Is it not marvelous, Ursula? God's will is surely with us. I am certain that the worst is over now." In all the time since they had fled from Semlin, they still had not seen Elizabeth. Ursula and Bruno began to fear she had been lost or killed. That night, however, she finally came, distraught, to their campsite. "My daughter," she cried as soon as she saw them. "How is she? Lemmet would not let me leave before. I think he thought I meant to flee in all the confusion. I was so worried about her. Where is she? May I see her?" "She is sleeping," Ursula answered. "Let her be for now. She's well, I promise you," she added quickly, putting out a restraining hand as Elizabeth made a move for the tent. "Thank God for his mercy," Elizabeth said. "But he wants her back. Now that calmer times seem to be upon us, Lemmet wants to start our concerts again, and he wants Verity back to collect coins. He will not be denied." "Back?" Ursula was incredulous. A wave of hot, possessive anger swept over her. She could feel again Verity's frail body pressed against her, see the terror in her eyes. "I nursed her and made her well. We protected her. I will not let her go back to that man. He will come and take her. He will kill you if you do not let her return." Elizabeth looked at Ursula desperately. I mean what I say. She stopped for a moment. He has killed before, she went on in a low voice. I've seen it. I can believe it, Ursula spat out. And he will probably kill Verity if she returns. No, I'll be more careful. I'll take care of her. Elizabeth's whole body was shaking. She's my daughter, she cried. I'll take care of her, I promise. As you've taken care of her so far? Just then, Verity heard her mother's voice. With a cry, she was out of the tent and into Elizabeth's arms. Elizabeth clutched the child tightly to her and bent her head over her daughter's. Her tears fell on the pale hair, her eyes implored Ursula. I will not let her go back, Ursula said. Her voice was adamant. In the end, Elizabeth was forced to give up and leave without the child. Watching her go, her shoulders bowed and shaking, Ursula was seized with pity. Then she tightened her lips and her face hardened. Lemmet was not going to beat Verity again, even if it cost Ursula her own life. She saw Bruno standing in the shadows watching. You think I am cruel to that poor woman, she said defensively. What, then, would you have me do? I know not, he answered. Geoffrey Bruhl and Walter of Beetle were released. The company made ready to start on their trip again. As they took their place in the train, however, Ursula and Bruno were overrun by a large group of angry men. They pushed past on the narrow trail, stumbling against the wagon. Too good for their boots, Ursula heard one of them grumble. They think they're better than honest pilgrims, that they do, another agreed. They staggered as they strode by. Their words were loud and slurred. Ursula realized they were drunk. They were filthy, their beards unkempt, and their clothes looked as if they had not been seen to for weeks. The red crosses that had been clumsily sewn on their shoulders hung in tatters for the most part. Their voices rose as the grumbling turned to shouts. They were fueling each other with their anger, leading each other on. Several of them were carrying torches. At this point the road crossed the ford of a river. In the clearing around the ford sat a small mill. That's the place, one of the men suddenly shouted. That's the miller there, who thought he was too fine for the likes of us. Too fine for us, is he? Yelled another. We'll show him. At once, a chorus of shouts and insults rose into the air. With one accord, the group of men turned away from the river and ran toward the mill, torches flaming. They threw 2 torches onto the thatched roof of the building, the others at and around the wooden sides. Bruno had just led their horse into the river moments before the outcry began. He looked back, startled, but the current, weak though it was, took all his attention. What's happening? He called out to Ursula. She twisted on the wagon seat to look, trying to make sense of what was going on. They've torched the mill, she cried. Those men, they've set fire to the mill. The building blazed up immediately. A woman carrying a baby ran out of it, 2 small children after her. A man followed. The man ran desperately to the river with a bucket, dipped it in, and ran back to throw water onto the flames. The effort was useless. Ursula watched helplessly from midstream while the men responsible fled and splashed noisily across. Not one other crusader still on that side of the river made a move to aid the miller and his family. Peter the Hermit and the leaders were already far up the road on the other side, well out of sight. There was no way they could know of what had happened. There was nothing Ursula and Bruno could do except maintain their place in the line of wagons. By the time they reached the other side of the river, the mill was enveloped in flames, beyond any hope of being saved. Ursula took up the reins, but she let the horse follow the others automatically. She, Bruno, and Master William watched the plume of black smoke rising until they were out of sight. Nicetas is a stern commander, Bruno said finally. He was more than patient with us, I think, more than forgiving. I fear he will not let this go unpunished. Nor did Nicetas wait long. Before noon of that day, a company of men rode furiously past them toward the head of the train. Rumors flew back, thick and fast. Nystas had attacked the rear guard before they could ford the river. There had been fighting. He had taken hostages, but was not satisfied with that. He was coming after them. Ursula realized that the pace had quickened. She had to urge the reluctant horse almost to a trot to keep up. Then suddenly a cloud of dust arose from way in front of them. Hooves thundered. A whole section of Peter's soldiers and guards, howling war cries, galloped back toward them, past them, and on to the rear to do battle with Nystas. After that all was thrown into confusion. The people panicked. Wagoners urged their horses into a gallop and thundered past Ursula and Bruno, their wagons sometimes perilously close to colliding. The people on foot at the rear dropped their bundles of food and supplies as they ran to keep up. Ursula whipped the horse on, but he was an old horse, not capable of more than what he was doing. Verity, behind her in the wagon, began to cry. Master William took her in his arms. It was a measure of her terror that she let him hold her. She had never let anyone but Ursula near her before. Samson cowered beside them. Bruno, what are we going to do? Ursula whipped at the horse again, caught up in the panic. Hope the rear guard can hold off Nystas's forces, Bruno answered grimly. Make that horse go as fast as you can, Ursula. He grabbed up a cudgel that he kept by the front seat of the wagon and turned to watch the road. Behind them, as far as he could see, was a flood of terrified humanity. Ursula looked back quickly over her shoulder and saw a wagon suddenly lurch off the path and overturn. It was immediately overrun and submerged by the wave of running people. She urged the horse on again, but now the beast was going at as close to a gallop as he could. Their wagon was bouncing and jolting in the ruts so hard she feared they would turn over as well, but she dared not slacken the pace. Suddenly screams broke out, just out of sight behind them, and a band of Nystas's soldiers appeared. They rode through the running people, swords slashing mercilessly. People fell and were trampled by other people fleeing over them. Bruno! All of Ursula's concentration was required to keep the horse under control, but she couldn't help another quick glance back. At that instant the soldiers reached the first of the wagons, and Ursula, horrified, saw a soldier lean from his horse and slice his sword deep into the chest of the man who was driving it. The man collapsed, and his horse, panicked by the noise and the smell of blood, bolted. Before Ursula could look away, it overran the wagon ahead of it and charged into the horse that pulled it. Both horses went down, both wagons disintegrated in a confusion of splintering wood and screams. The soldiers were checked by the wreckage, but only momentarily. They swung out around it and began to cut a new swath through the people on either side of it. Pull off! Bruno shouted. Ursula looked at him in astonishment. Pull off! He shouted again. We can't outrun them. We've got to get away. He pointed at the thick trees to the right of them. Pull the wagon over as close as you can to the trees, and we'll make a run for it. He turned to Master William in the back. Give me Verity as soon as we stop, Master, he yelled. You'll have to jump off and run for the trees. Do you understand? The old man nodded. In all the confusion, he seemed almost calm. Give this to Ursula, he called back, and passed up his bag of herbs and medicines to Bruno. We will need it. Ursula wrenched the reins to the right. The horse, too panic-stricken now to know what was happening, followed the command blindly. They jarred over the stubble that bordered the road. Ursula had a moment of fear that they wouldn't be able to stop before they reached the trees. A vision of the wagon crashing into the thick forest rose sickeningly in her mind. Then, at the last possible second, she threw every ounce of strength she had into pulling back on the reins. Whoa! She screamed. For one disastrous moment she thought they were lost. Then the horse swerved and finally halted, his sides heaving and soaked with sweat. Bruno tossed her father's bag, and in the same motion reached back for Verity. Ursula leaped off the wagon and reached up to help her father. The old man jumped down with surprising agility, Samson close behind. They tore for the trees. They ran without stopping for breath, as far into the forest as they could, but they couldn't outrun the screaming. It went on and on. Ursula dropped to her knees and covered her ears with her hands, but she couldn't shut out the sound. Finally it stopped. and then there was a deathly silence. Bruno, Master William, and Ursula stared at each other. Verity clung to Ursula. "We must stay here until all danger is past," Bruno said. They were well away from the road, but even so he whispered. Ursula nodded. As night fell, they huddled together, sheltering each other as best they could with their cloaks. They didn't speak. Only Verity slept. They didn't stir from their hiding place until dawn broke the next morning, and the birds began to call sleepily in the trees around them. Ursula winced as she stood up. She was cold. The damp seemed to have seeped right through her and into her bones. She ached in every joint and muscle. As she looked anxiously toward her father, he too roused himself and began to cough. The coughing shook his frail frame so much that he could not speak. "We must get back to where we left the horse and wagon," she said to Bruno. He didn't answer. "It might still be there," she insisted. "It's possible that they've left it." Bruno's face told her how unlikely he thought this to be. They wakened Verity and started back through the trees. Samson trotted at their heels. Even he seemed subdued. Aside from the birds now singing lustily in the forest around them, there was only that same ominous silence. As they drew near the edge of the forest and began to tread more cautiously, they stopped speaking and listened intently, but there was nothing to be heard. None of the usual noise of the awakening of a camp of thousands that had filled the air every morning since they had left Cologne. No sounds of priests saying masses. They emerged from the woods and looked around cautiously. At first there was nothing to be seen. Then Ursula gasped. Their wagon was almost where they had left it, but it lay on its side, the wheels smashed beyond repair. Ursula ran toward it, forgetting all caution, but came to an abrupt halt with a cry of despair. The horse lay on the ground in front of the wagon, still in his traces, dead. "Why kill him?" she burst out. "Why would they kill a horse?" "They couldn't take him, I suppose, and they didn't want us to have him," Bruno answered. His voice was bitter. He rummaged through the ruination in and around the fallen wagon. "They've spoiled all our supplies. Didn't even take them. Just made them unfit for us. I don't know if we'll be able to salvage anything." Ursula turned away from the dead animal and went back to help Bruno. She couldn't talk. There were no words to express what she felt. Together, with Verity hindering more than helping, they searched through the mess for something that would still be edible. Their sack of grain had been split open and was spilled over the ground. Ursula found a small pouch and gathered up as much as she could. At first she tried to avoid picking up dirt as well. Soon she gave up and just dumped everything in together. Sticks, lumps of earth, she'd separate it later. Master William rummaged around in what was left of their clothing. "They've slashed everything," he said. The note of confusion was back in his voice. His face was blank and hopeless again. After his brief burst of energy the day before, his body now sagged with weariness. He gave up his search and slumped to the ground, his back against the ruin of the wagon. "There's nothing left," he shook his head slowly from side to side. "Nothing left, and we were so close, so close. I thought I would see Constantinople and Jerusalem. Am I never to pray in our holiest of cities now?" Ursula wanted with all her heart to reassure him, to vow that his dreams would come true, but how could she? This surely was the end. She and Bruno rescued what they could, and piled it in a heap. It was pitifully small. "Dare we make a fire?" she asked Bruno. Then another fear hit her. "The flints, the tinder!" "It's all right," Bruno answered. "I made certain to take them with me when we fled." They collected twigs, wood, even bits of demolished wagon, and soon had a small blaze going. It didn't offer much warmth, but just the sight of it was comforting. Ursula sat her father down beside it and then retrieved a piece of blanket and wrapped it around his shoulders. He hardly seemed to notice what she was doing. "We must find water," she said. First we had better see what has happened, Bruno said grimly. See where all the others are. The road itself from which they had escaped the day before lay hidden behind the slight rise they had bumped over so desperately. Ursula looked toward it. I'll go with you, she said, but she was filled with dread. The silence. What would they find? Do you think it's safe now? I think so, Bruno answered. There would be no reason for Nicetas's men to stay around. They've had their revenge. Leaving Verity with Master William and Samson tied to the wagon with a bit of cord that Bruno had salvaged, they climbed over the rise. Ursula took one look at what lay before them, and her heart seemed to stop. As far as she could see, bodies littered the road. Men, women, children, all scattered as if carelessly flung by some giant hand. Wagons were overturned and demolished. The bodies of horses, donkeys, and cows lay among the bodies of the people. Blood was everywhere, and now Ursula became aware of the smell, a smell like the stench of the butcher's alley in Cologne. It's not possible. She couldn't look away. Isn't there anyone left alive at all? Her voice rose, close to hysteria. Beside her, Bruno stood, as if frozen. As if in answer to Ursula, there was movement on the other side of the road. The ground sloped steeply up into the mountains there. A small knot of people were emerging timidly from the shelter of the trees. They, too, stopped when they saw the carnage in front of them. Then they looked across at Bruno and Ursula, but in silence. No shouts or greetings were exchanged. No one spoke.